Hey, CD, can you, tell us your favorite RPG romance? Not unless everyone gets real cool about a bunch of stuff really quickly. I think it's safe to say that optional romance in RPGs has gone from side content to the most prominent feature in the game. So much so that not only is it often the first question asked when a character-driven RPG is announced, but if a game doesn't have it, people get pissy. I've always had mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I adore a good love story. Character relationships are more important than literally everything else in a story from my point of view. But on the other hand, RPG romance has always left me feeling a touch cold and uninterested. While the concept of optional romance always fascinated me, rarely did that ever end up with me taking one of those options, because the following sequence usually occurs. 1, I look up the romance options and go, oh, they look cool. And 2, I get in game and they're completely insufferable and I want them out of the party immediately. So it was often a rare instance where I ever bothered with romance, and last year when I was doing a project on the entire Dragon Age series, I straight up forgot romance was even in half of the games, largely because I intensely disliked the companions my characters were able to romance to begin with. But the 1-2 punch of Baldur's Gate 3 and Dragon Age Veilguard bringing romance as a discussion to the forefront has left me pondering the subject, particularly one rather notorious aspect of both games, and that is player-sexual characters. For those who just crawled out of their hobbit hole, or who have been playing multiplayer-only games for the last 20 years, player-sexual refers to a state where an RPG has optional romance and every romanceable character is available regardless of race, gender, morality, and story decisions. In most cases, the only way to permanently lock off a romance is to deliberately kill the character or end their companion quests on unfavorable terms. At no point, once you create the character, are romance options locked off. This is most prominent in Dragon Age 2, Pillars of Eternity 2, Baldur's Gate 3, and Dragon Age Veilguard. There may be others, but I haven't played literally every RPG on the planet. Dragon Age 2 was the earliest example, as of the 10 companions available, 5 were romanceable and all of them were bisexual and/or bereft of the usual prejudices that would have made Hawke unable to even go near them. To Dragon Age 2's credit, the other 5 are unromanceable for extremely good reasons that even BioWare would have had a hard time getting past. Dragon Age 2 was actually heavily criticized back in the day, largely by Chud shrieking about the gays, but even by some LGBT people who felt that every romanceable companion being bisexual was exploitative, as if the only reason for bisexual characters to exist is a big ol' fuck party. The environment around the games industry at the time played a factor in this. People inside and outside the industry were trying to push away from incessant horniness and blatant objectification. There was a strong desire for video games to be taken more seriously, and juvenile shit like this was considered to be passé at best. We didn't just want the girls to fuck, we wanted the girls to have fully developed character arcs. That's not really the case anymore. There's just as many people now arguing for shallow gooning as a virtue as there are people arguing otherwise. Player-sexual characters are a mixed bag to say the least. Some people like them because it maximizes player choice and means you can snuggle up to any hottie you like. Others dislike it specifically because it reduces characters down to romanceable archetypes like a visual novel dating sim. Player-sexual companions is one of those points where games as art actively comes into conflict with the notion of games as toys for play. It is inherently restricting and often leads to characters being weaker and less nuanced as a result of them all needing to be sexually appealing. It also means that if you set out to make every character romanceable and available to the player at all times, you inherently exclude literally some of the best companions ever made in any game ever. It's hard to do characters like Imoen or Mission or Kreia or Morden in an environment where if someone really likes them and they aren't romanceable, they start whining and moaning. People aren't blind to this either. Player-sexual is practically a dirty word. It's an inherent criticism, which is why a common response I've seen from developers, especially in the case of Baldur's Gate 3 and Veilguard, is, well, our companions are all canonically pansexual or bisexual, so we reject the label of player-sexual. I have an issue with this on two fronts. One, player-sexual is a criticism reflecting that the characters are designed to be pin-ups and playthings first, and characters second. So the idea that you can just reject it like a genre label is strange, to say the least. Two, the idea that you can head off claims of being player-sexual by saying everyone's canonically pan is weird because pansexuality is not the opposite of player-sexual, it's a prerequisite. If Mass Effect 3 let male Shepard sleep with Trainer despite it being established that she's gay through the sheer power of main character, we wouldn't call that player-sexual, we'd call that violently homophobic, or Fire Emblem. See, what player-sexual fundamentally means is the developer going far out of its way to avoid saying no to the player regarding cheap visceral thrills. So any possibility for an incompatible orientation or a difference in taste or pre-existing relationships getting in the way are all quietly shunted aside. It's extremely difficult to permanently and irrevocably lock off a romance entirely unless you do something so beyond the realm of acceptable that the writers can't reliably ignore it. In Baldur's Gate 3, not only is every companion save Minsk and Chihiro romanceable, but the companions listed as origin companions all have effectively the same story so that they can be slotted in and out of cutscenes at will. And the game makes it so that the only way to lock off their romance is to kill them or side against the Druid Enclave in the first act. If you're a Dark Urge, you could permanently lock off your romance with Minthara by resisting Baal's influence because Minthara chases power to her own detriment. But players cried about the very idea of consequences, so it was removed. That's it. Kill them, become a straight-up villain, or take a decision the party's resident dumbfuck disagrees with before a patch taking it out. Outside of that, not only is it extremely easy to maintain a romance, the game is weirdly pushy about making sure you do. If you don't have a relationship, Wither starts pestering you about it, and even your Dream Guardian tries to get in your pants, which was very weird for me because I'd made the Dream Guardian look like my character's mother. Come on, Baldur, this is not that kind of actually, no, I guess it is that kind of game. Now, Baldur's Gate 3 is not shy about the fact that it's player-sexual. Larian sure is, making the same canonically pansexual argument a lot of people try to make, but the game itself is one big horny fiesta. Characters are often weirdly flirtatious, and the only one for whom it makes sense to do so is Astarion, because he's a vampire. Seducing someone is how you get easy access to their neck, and vampires have metaphorically played double duty as sexual predator and leeching billionaire, but I repeat myself. He's also a sexual slavery victim, and as such, he's been Pavlov like crazy. Veilguard tries to head this off by having companions get into relationships with other people. Balara and Davrin are the only ones who don't, because their stories fundamentally involve their focus and attention being on Syrian and Asan respectively, meaning outside of Rook, they wouldn't otherwise have time for such a thing. Balara is also implied to be in love with Rook regardless, but in all these cases, Rook still has first pick. These characters don't get into other relationships until you are past the final conversation where you can lock in a romance, and even then, you have to be the one to encourage them to do it. If you don't, if you avoid those conversations, then they simply don't happen. So at all avenues, the player is the one completely in control of a character's availability for romance. Okay, CD, but how do we avoid being player-sexual? Make characters unavailable, duh. Variety of sexual orientation is the easiest way to do that. Some characters are bi, some are straight, some are gay. This is a no-brainer here. RPGs used to work like this, but it fundamentally ran into one problem. Players didn't like hearing no. Dragon Age Inquisition had characters with preset orientations. One in particular, Cassandra, was straight. Makes sense, her character is basically what if the Catholic Church has its own CIA, so they probably didn't like gay people in. But because she's a warrior class and has short hair, a lot of people got upset they couldn't have a sapphic relationship with her. First problem, you're reducing sexuality to aesthetic preferences, bad kitty, go to horny jail. The second problem is that people think this is a problem that needs solving. I'm sorry that you don't get to sleep with the butch religious police, but such is life, unfortunately. Each available gender does still have 2 men and 2 women available. I mean, really sit back and think about the kind of incel logic that's apparent to complaining you can't romance the person you like the most. If this were men complaining they can't fuck Sarah, nobody would consider that something worth listening to beyond asking, why would you want to fuck Sarah unless you're really creepily into elves denigrating themselves for human approval? Orientation isn't the only factor, of course. In Baldur's Gate 2, every companion romance is available to humans, half-elves, elves, and halflings, with 2 exceptions. Aerie is also willing to hook up with a gnome because she was raised by gnomes and worships a gnomish god, and as such is more partial to them, whereas anyone else would look at them and go, no, come on, be serious here. Viconia is not available to elves because she's a drow. They fucking hate elves. But she is available to half-orcs because she considers them more of a challenge. These are factors that are fundamentally the result of a character's experiences, and when you look at them, your first thought is immediately, oh yeah, that makes sense. In most games, morality and decision-making factors into romance as well. In Mass Effect, if you actively go against a character's wishes, they aren't available to you. Revealing the treason of Tally's father, for example, permanently locks off Tally's romance because she isn't loyal, and if she's not in a relationship with Shepard in 2, she's not available in 3. Siding against a character when their conflict with another crew member happens does the same thing. These aren't massive, earth-shaking decisions, but they're decisions that hurt the people in question. It makes them feel more like thinking, breathing people when they can be angry with you in ways that have terrible consequences. Garrus is the only character for whom his romance is impossible to completely lock out aside from just not doing it or cheating on him. And for Garrus, that actually makes sense because Garrus and Shepard's friendship is a big part of his story, and there aren't really any instances where Garrus goes against Shepard on anything because the two are pretty in sync ideologically and ethically. In an environment where every character has their own opinions and desires, a single character who's ride or die for the player is actually fun. It's why everyone loves Imoen so much. Well, everyone with a soul at least. Mass Effect also takes the rather bold decision to take a romance ending completely out of the player's hands. In the second game, if you have a relationship with Thane or Jacob, both end up not lasting through Mass Effect 3. Thane is killed and Jacob ends up falling in love with someone else while you're in lockup for a year. People have justifiable criticisms about the latter. Out of all the characters to cheat on Shepard, of course you chose Jacob, BioWare, not Kaidan or Ashley or Liara, rather tellingly. But at the same time, it's a bold decision to take a romance's end out of the player's hands like that. It's something no game has ever done before or since, probably because people reacted so badly to it. I'm gonna say it, I like that Jacob cheats on Shepard. It's an ugly breakup, and the player's only real options are to either let it be water under the bridge or to be angry about it. Given that Shepard was in lockup for a year, it's not like Jacob even had the chance to send a Dear John letter, but at the same time, Shepard's pain is justifiable. It's a romance option that doesn't lead to a happy ending, reflecting the reality that not every relationship works out and you don't get that wasted time back. It also reflects the fact that your characters aren't just sitting in a green room waiting for the player's presence to give their lines meaning. They have lives of their own, and being locked up for a year can certainly strain a relationship. Some of them will wait for you, some of them won't, and some of them just straight up can't. It's the thing that makes femshep's romances so much more interesting than male shepherd, because they're all varied and unique and with unique outcomes. There are valid complaints about how out of all the characters they gave this story to, it was the lone black man in the companions, but the solution wouldn't be to not have this story at all. The solution would have been to have the Vermeer survivor also do it, because their relationship with Shepard is extremely strained by Mass Effect 3. Mass Effect treats romance as a story, and not all stories have happy endings. It also benefits from having 3 games to develop a lot of these relationships, something no other RPG has ever had. Veilguard has one that should end this way, but doesn't. If you're in a relationship with Emmerich, there's a point where he explains that to become a Lich means he can't be biased or self-serving. This is in relationship to raising Manfred after his death, but this stipulation doesn't extend to his relationship with Rook. By all metrics, the Liches should have the same attitude about romance, but they just don't, for no other reason than the fact that they don't want to tell players, no, you can't have your skeleton husband, otherwise they'd have been legally liable when the book talk girlies jumped. This is what playersexual means, even in a situation where the player should be told no, where everything about the story has been screaming for that to be the case, the story bends over backwards to avoid doing that anyway. While I don't count it as an example, Balara's romance equally makes me uncomfortable because it's the same problem with Jaheira. There's always something really sleazy about trying to seduce someone who is currently grieving. Baldur's Gate 2 is a little better with this because both the Ward and Jaheira are experiencing probably the worst loss they will ever experience, so it's more like a bad coping mechanism, but that's kind of a me thing, and that's a point where player choice does factor in. I've always had the same opinion about Meryl's romance. The way in which it starts always feels like Marion is coping with Bethany's death or imprisonment very poorly, like she's a protagonist in a Netflix cartoon. But I'd wonder if anyone else put that kind of thought into this at all. I know there's a lot of age gap discourse with Emmerich, but people have historically never been consistent with that complaint. But the idea of, oh god, I can't flirt with this person, they're going through the absolute worst hell imaginable, that'd just be creepy, isn't really something people think about. I'm not saying that if you did the Balara romance that you yourself are creepy, just that Balara's story tends to support you not doing that in the first place. Rook in general is just a little too emotionally stable in a party of people experiencing severe grief, loss, and mental health problems to make really any romance not feel like she's taking advantage of someone at that point. But that ends up being my point. Characterization and a character's story is second to them being a romance option. It's the thing that gets sacrificed so every character is romanceable. It's extremely hard to render them unromanceable, and the actual romance itself is less about telling a story and more about giving flirty dialogue in a PG-13 sex scene, often completely divorced from the themes of that character's story. I think back to Garrus, which has his feelings of screwing things up in his life compound against not wanting to risk his relationship with Shepard. It makes a series of flirts that start out rather silly and awkward into something really tender and heartfelt. He's trying to do the whole cool bad boy thing, but he's Garrus. He's a square. It's like being hit on by Clark Kent. Stop trying to act cool, Garrus. I know you play Relays and Reapers.
Try small talk.
Come here often. I imagine anyone who does is probably an alcoholic.
If they had focused primarily on Garrus being the sexy alien husband, it would have been poorer for it. He may have a voice like sitting on a washing machine on a flight with heavy turbulence, but that doesn't mean he has a personality to match. It's funny that way. RPG romance is never going to escape the specter of playersexual so long as romance itself continues to be written in such a shallow way that prioritizes instant gratification over telling an interesting story, and I'm pretty sure I'm increasingly alone in wanting it to. I actually looked over a lot of these games to see who I'd actually romance, and in the vast majority of cases the answer was nobody. Only about 4, and one of them is a mod, so it doesn't really count. I did the Meryl romance for the Dragon Age video, only to realize I had nothing to say about Dragon Age's approach to romance. In most games, I either didn't like any companions enough to want to talk to them, and when I did, any thought toward being flirty just felt like I was playing against character. In Dragon Age Origins, my romance options were 2 humans, and I couldn't really find any explanation where Callie and Tabris, of all people, would actually get in bed with a human. And I've been long against this idea of RPG romance getting broader at the cost of getting less interesting. RPGs can only ever have so much content in them, and the more variables you introduce, the less interesting things those variables are able to explore. I've heard some people say they want Larian to remake the original Baldur's Gate tetralogy, which is inherently ridiculous because Baldur's Gate 3 took them 6 years to release and 8 years to finish, and the original series is 20 times the size of that game. Taking a story that large, that thematically cohesive, and with that deep of characterization, and putting it into full 3D with every conversation given full cinematic animation would be a task no developer would be capable capable of. That game would be a terabyte in size. It's just inherently difficult to have as wide of player choice as humanly possible, while also making the game interesting because video games are so labor-intensive to make, and high-quality storytelling has never gotten along with player choice very well. Okay, CD, so how do we fix it? Fix it? Pixie would have to want to be fixed. This is the important part. None of what I just described is what most players want. Most players want to watch the hot people do the do. They want to charm their favorite waifu, and things like depth of character and something being thematically appropriate just doesn't matter to them. It's similar to the way pro-shippers talk, treating media like empty, meaningless junk food to be consumed and thrown away. The idea that art exists to inspire or invoke feelings in people more complicated than visceral gratification is increasingly discounted. You probably heard someone on social media in the past make the bold claim that fiction doesn't affect reality, which is just frighteningly bad awareness of the very concept of art and the fact that art historically has always affected reality. I mean, slavery abolition was sparked by a book, for fuck's sake. The very concept of thematic weight in a story is being treated as if it doesn't exist. But once you step back and remember that people always state their opinions as objective fact, you realize that fiction doesn't affect reality is what they want to be true. The idea of art as having meaning or value is the primary thing getting in the way of their fun. And a lot of the complaints of sanitized media is about a lot of creators not being on that wavelength of upbeat nihilism, of still having a creative vision more nuanced than morbid, unrestrained self-indulgence. And RPG romance is just close enough to the visual novel singularity to be affected by this first. As a result, RPGs go out of their way to create situations where they don't say no to the player regarding sex, and then people only get antsy about it when you point out that that's what they're doing. So me laying all this out, likely there's a few of you going, what the fuck are you talking about, CD? I'm not here to ruminate on the ethics of flirting with someone in the worst kind of rebound. I'm here to get my rocks off with the cute engineer lady. Which is fair. I mean, I don't understand why you're watching a CD call video if you didn't want to get weirdly philosophical about something that ultimately doesn't matter, but you do you. If developers would just drop the pretense and admit that's what they're doing, where romance exists for no other reason than because fucking your party members is fun, then I'd be less bothered by it. But no, they turn around and try to argue that they're not with extremely weak excuses that just make you wonder, how much does the phrase playersexual bother you? Being compared to a visual novel dating sim clearly bothers them, even when that's exactly what this aspect of RPGs is turning into. It's been suggested by others that letting you fuck the party members is included more for the sake of tradition, like it's a required feature alongside branching narrative and the concept of companions at all. But that being said, that implies that there's a significant sea change toward art being made more shallow and more gratuitous for the sake of cheap thrills at the expense of anything that might get in the way of that. And the truth is that while that audience does exist and is quite loud, I don't think most people actually treat art that way. There's been a pretty heavy and significant backlash to pro-shippers and the way they tend to denigrate and disrespect art as a concept, and people still tend to roll their eyes at sex scenes they consider pointless. Some people have tried to paint that as some kind of new age Puritan uprising, but that sentiment was always there. It was the dominant discussion around the games industry for a decade, and it still is. Baldur's Gate 3 sold like crazy, but we have Steam achievements telling us that only 50% of players actually made it halfway through the game. Most people who play these kind of games tend to come to the same conclusion that RPG romance always sucks. And there's an argument to be made that Baldur's Gate 2's goofy melodrama to its romance was always going to head closer to the visual novel singularity than it was to anything with more drama, and I'm the only one who ever wanted something else out of it. So calling something playersexual is as mundane and obvious a description as calling a sex scene in a film superfluous. It's supposed to be that way. If it was any other way, nobody would be happy. I don't really have much of a conclusion for this, as I can't decide if the dating sim approach to romance is a problem, since I've already demonstrated I could just not do it, and oftentimes the story is better served if I don't. But at the same time, I feel like optional content can be criticized because time had to go into it that could have gone into something else, like having only a single romance option but making that romance really interesting and nuanced, or having all of them end badly because your character is doomed by the narrative, or having a character's relationship get smacked with a second act plot twist that renders continuing it an extremely difficult ethical dilemma. Just, something with a little more bite to it than just fuck the hot person. This does ultimately come down to personal taste. Me personally, I love my duos. I always write characters in pairs, and that relationship always ends up being the most interesting to me, regardless of if it's romantic, platonic, familial, or bonded like stray cats who can't be adopted separately. And I take that with me into the media I consume as well. Give me a good main duo, and their relationship in whatever form it takes is the one I'm most interested in. And RPG romance just seems increasingly like something I should just leave in the dust, specifically because we don't get those kind of duos anymore. We don't get a Warden MON or Shepard and Garrus anymore, platonic or romantic. RPG protagonists are increasingly blank slates, afraid to impose anything on the player at all, and the brief period of time where that wasn't the case is looking increasingly like an outlier. And I don't think many other people besides me cared about that to begin with, so maybe it's best left alone.